When making tables, a design element that I often include is breadboard ends. I include them both because I like the look and because they serve to keep the panel flat for wider tops. In this video, I'll cover the method I use to make breadboard ends for a cherry top that I'm currently making for a dog crate. I'll cover the making of the dog crate itself in a separate video. For wider tabletops, the first step is to dimension the boards for the top and then glue up the panel. Glue up is pretty straightforward, but you want to take extra care that your boards are flat and that their edges are square. The one tip I can offer here is to lay out your top and then as a last step before glue up, run each board edge through the jointer again, taking a light pass. The real tip is to make sure that as you run each joint through the jointer, you run one board with the top facing into the jointer fence, and then for the board on the other side of the joint, run it such that the top of the board is facing out from the jointer fence. Doing this will result in a flat top, even if your jointer fence isn't perfectly square to the table. For wider tops, I will sometimes include biscuits in the joint, and I did so for this top. It's a misconception that the biscuits are there to strengthen the edge joint. The glue really provides all the strength you'll ever need. The biscuits are really just there to help keep the boards aligned during glue up. For gluing up wider panels, I'm a big fan of these Bessey K-body parallel jaw clamps. They provide a solid flat base to ensure flat panels, and they provide lots of clamping pressure. Just make sure your boards are pushed firmly into the clamp bars as you glue the panels up. I usually put a couple of clamps on the top of the panel to keep it from bowing upwards, but that really shouldn't be a problem anyway if you followed my previous tip when edge jointing the boards. With the top glued up and sanded, let's get to cutting the breadboard ends. The key to the process is the little jig you see here. It consists of 2 strips of 3/4 inch plywood and a couple of blocks of wood the same thickness as the tabletop. Those blocks are just offcuts from the boards that make up the tabletop. You'll see in a minute how I use the jig with my router to make the breadboard ends, but it also comes in handy for making the crosscut if you don't have a panel saw or a track saw. To minimize tear out, I'm cutting to a line that I've marked with a knife, and I've set the depth of cut to just slightly deeper than the panel thickness. I use calipers to measure the exact thickness of the existing top, do a little math to figure out the depth of cut that will leave the tenon just slightly thicker than the desired final thickness. I'm using a 5/8 inch guide bushing on my router with a 1/2 inch router bit, so the final position of the fence needs to be offset 1/8 of an inch from where I want the final tenon shoulder. I mark the tenon shoulder with a knife to leave a clear line and to minimize tear out as I cut the tenon. I take several passes on both sides until I've cut back the material to reveal the full tenon length. The key is to be careful not to move the jig on that final pass so that each side of the tenon shoulder is at the same depth. It's a bit of a pain because I have to reposition the clamp each time. With the full width tenon cut, I then mark out and remove some material to leave 3 smaller tenons and a tongue. The reason for this is that if you cut a full width mortise on the mating breadboard end, the wood has a tendency to separate over time, opening up the joint. Using 3 tenons provides enough support while leaving enough material on the mortise side to support the joint. I just use a jigsaw to cut away the material between the tenons and at the ends. I then lay out the breadboard ends underneath the top and mark the location of the mortises from the tenons. The outer mortises I'll extend about 1/4 of an inch on each side of the tenon to allow for wood movement when the top expands and contracts with seasonal moisture changes. If you don't allow for movement, I promise you, your top will split in the drier winter months. I cut the mortises using a carbide upcut spiral bit mounted in my router table. I say it's an upcut bit, but since it's mounted upside down in the router table, it's actually pulling material down through the table. After a test cut to make sure I have the fence positioned correctly, I take a full width pass to cut the groove to match the full width tongue in the top. I then set a deeper depth of cut, drop the workpiece onto the bit, and cut each of the 3 mortises for the longer tenons, taking a couple of passes to get to the full mortise depth. In this case, full depth is 1.25 inches. I mentioned earlier that when I first cut the tenon, I set my router depth of cut to leave the tenon slightly thick. To ensure an accurate fit, I plane the tenon down to its final thickness by hand using a shoulder plane. Yes. With the ends installed, I use some long clamps to apply a little bit of inward pressure, and I then drill holes for the pins, which will be centered on each of the 3 tenons. The wood block clamped to the underside of the table here prevents tear out on the far side of the hole. Leaving the breadboard ends a little bit long at this stage makes it easier to remove them for the next step, which is to slot the holes in the outer tenons to allow for wood movement. I cut some matching cherry dowel pins using a plug cutter mounted in my drill press. I install the breadboard ends for a final test fit and mark the ends to be cut so that they match the width of the top. I apply glue to the center mortises, but no glue is used on the outer tenons to allow for wood movement. I fully glue in the center pin, but for the outer pins, I drive them most of the way in, then apply just a little bit of glue to the top edge before driving the pin an extra 1/4 of an inch deeper, so that glue is just at the top edge of the pin so as not to restrict wood movement. From there, I did some finish sanding. I also put a 1/4 inch chamfer on each edge of the top before sanding with increasingly fine grits as far as 320 grit. Then it's ready for finish. Up until now, my go-to finish for natural cherry has always been this Watco Danish oil in a natural finish. However, when I went to buy some this time, I couldn't find it anywhere on the shelves. They have walnut, medium walnut, but none of the natural finish. So I thought it was a good chance to try this tried and true varnish oil. It's nice. It's a natural finish, food safe. Pretty easy to apply. Apply a thin coat, allow it to penetrate 60 minutes, and then rub it with a lint-free cloth until the surface is dry. Allow the piece to cure for a minimum of 24 hours for additional coats. They recommend burnishing between coats with a soft cloth or 4/0 steel wool. The more you rub it, the better it will look. And with that, I guess I'll close this video. As always, thanks for watching.